and Ruandi on behalf of Shanika for your insightful presentations. Now on to the panel discussion on the role of women in organizational transformation. I'd like to invite on stage Dusty Alamakun, Sabrina Esfari, and Dr. Miriam D'Souza for the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Ruandi Pereira.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you're having an insightful and interesting evening, and I hope we're going to make it even more interesting with three lenses to look at the role of women in organizational transformation. I'm not going to introduce the panel one more time. Let's get on right to it. We've been talking a lot about organizational transformation, which is not only the need of the hour, but it's the need of everyone. But what we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are failing in transformation, be it digital, be it otherwise. We saw an article in the September issue of HBR 2022 say 87.5% of digital transformations fail, with people being cited as the biggest factor. And there are Gartner study that same year mentioned how employees on average went through 10 planned company transitions or transformations, but their engagement with the transition and their willingness to support was just 46% in 2022 compared to 76% in 2016. So Darcy, I want to direct my first question to you. There's clearly a transformation deficit in the engagement needed and the willingness. How should organizations look at bridging this gap?
Okay, thanks, Ru. And I think that's true. If you look at globally, the failure rate is around 60-70% of any kind of transformation. And when we say failure rate of 60-70%, they don't produce the intended results. It kind of drops off at many levels. And this whole transformation, people want the big change happening. And the pace of transformation is one of the reasons. How fast can we transform? And typically, this pace of transformation is about three things. One is the consumer, other one is the competition, other one is the company, what we call the three C's. And typically, consumer has changed, competition has changed, and now we are in a mighty hurry to catch up, and we want things done yesterday. And the leaders want things done pretty fast. And in this hurry, they don't distinguish what we call change and transition. I think change happens outside. Transition is what people go through, how we reorient ourselves to that change. So what happens largely is that we don't give space, we don't really facilitate them transitioning people, and therefore we see them as resistant to change. And we can discuss it more as we go along. So this resistance to change finally results in this transformation deficit that we see. So I think again it's a leadership trait, like the presenter spoke about. How should we or how do we be good at this whole transition, taking the critical approach? So that is one of the biggest issues for this failure.
Thank you, Darcy. So kind of building up on that, Darcy spoke of the pace of change and organizations having to take people through this transition. But if we focus on the root cause here, or one of the root causes rather, employees' unwillingness to change. From your perspective, what causes it and what can be done to change it?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I've seen two sort of tripping points. One is that I think most transformations are conceived, as in thought process of transformation typically happen in a boardroom or at a very high level in the organization.
But transformation really has to be done with the organization. As in, the board members aren't going to step down and actually make the transformation happen. So I think when organizations focus too much on the fancy PowerPoint presentation and too little on aligning the organization in terms of, individuals in the organization need to understand that the transformation is good for the company, good for their careers. And so really the why of the transformation has to flow through the entire organization. And I think the organization has to invest a significant amount of time in, telling people what is expected of them in this transformation and how the organization plans to get them from point A to B. And I think really here the devil is in the details because transformations, if done well, require consistency. They require discipline and they are quite exhausting to do right. So I think it's really that focus on aligning the organization that I think is key. Secondly, I think as you mentioned this, typically transformation is resisted by some employees, and from observing the reasons behind it often comes from a place of insecurity, where they resist it because they don't feel like they have the skills to actually go through with it, and therefore their careers are they perceive their careers being at risk. And so I think to really overcome this, organizations, I think have to do one of two things. One is you have to first be really proactive about investing in your people at the same time as you're investing in the processes and the infrastructure of the transformation. So I think that investment is critical, that skills building. And also I think you have to hire for the skills that you need, assuming the transformation happens. So you have to hire proactively as opposed to hire whenever you get a vacancy. So I think that requires discipline. And the second thing is, and this is the hard part, like once you've tried all of that, I think at some point an organization can also outgrow its people. And so being open and transparent about that and giving people consistent feedback so they know where they're at, and they know that there could be a point in which the organization and the person have to separate, I think is also a really important conversation to have. So I think that's kind of how I see it.
Thanks, Sabrina. You highlighted two good points, one for Dusty and one for Mihiri, but I'm going to first ask from Mihiri. Like she said, most of the transformation happens on fancy slides in the boardroom. Looking at it from a leadership coach perspective, what do you think is the gap here? Because everyone seems to be knowing where one of the gaps at least are in terms of leadership and silent leadership and how they take people through transition. But what exactly is missing?
So I was thinking, about the statistics that you shared, and I thought I'd make it a little bit more current and think about the Sri Lankan context. So there has been a real dire need for transformation in the last 4 years. COVID, economic crisis, and organizations have been scrambling to deal with the crisis. So when I think about the organizations that I worked with, one of the things that I find that is that in the transformation context, it also look at the wider context. So if you look at Sri Lanka and what's currently what's currently happening, I think COVID, there was a big burnout. So whilst it was really necessary, there were so many basic survival things that people had to face that kind of change was hard. And as we got through it, then we had the economic crisis. So what I think is that, but at that point we saw real innovation happening. So I think from a leadership point of view, I really do agree with what what Dusty and Sabrina talked about, that we really saw in the last few years where people rose to the challenge. But the problem is keeping sustainability. When there is a crisis, people will rise to challenges and will come through, will step up. But I think what is really important is that it doesn't just, we can't just talk about it in a boardroom, in this like a big strategy session. What leadership has to do is to actually also get down to the ground level. Because leadership happens at the middle management level, even further down. So if you don't involve people in the conversations, and it is not, I feel that it's not only about saying why the change is necessary, asking what they think the change is necessary, because people also know what's happening. I mean, they may not have the wider context of where the organization wants to go, but they can see what's happening contextually outside. So asking what involving them also in the input, and once, so it is almost like I think about like if you're facilitating, these kinds of transformation projects, is also getting their input as well as getting them involved in prioritizing some of the areas. So you may have 20 things you want to, everybody will have the ideas, but eventually maybe only 3 things happen. So if they're also part of the decision-making process, so that it can be top down, bottoms up, so that it's actually you're meeting in the middle. So that it's a real dialogue. So I think that's where the time investment, that you talked about is so key.
Thanks, Miri. Darcy, Sabrina mentioned employees being insecure, having an insecurity to change. What are your thoughts on how they can get out of this, if I may call it the fear zone?
Yes, I think whenever you introduce change, I mean, like Sabrina said, as leaders, we present PowerPoint and we are really convinced about the plan and we want to get on with it. But everyone is thinking, what is in it for me? Right? That's the thought that goes through, and probably they lose 60% of the PowerPoint that we present, right? And like she correctly said, people resist because number one, they might lose something. The fear of, can I do the new thing? Or I have a different take on what this change is. I either think it has to be done differently, or I think the change is not needed. At the same time, I'm not informed, I'm not involved. Right? So these are the typical ones that that we go through, and especially if you look at what Kavita and what Shamindra spoke about, this space needs a lot more human dimension, because although we talk about it very rationally, what the end state is, that transition requires a lot of empathy, holding space, discussions. I'm not anyway saying that we have a therapy session in the office, but the idea is we need to respect those feelings, and if you try to fast track those never happen. So I think dealing with them in a very human way, and the fact that you mentioned that some of them know that company has outgrown me, I need to move out, but those conversations have to happen in the right way.
Thank you, Darcy. I'm aware that Sabrina has to say goodbye to us. Maybe I want to ask one more thing from you, Sabrina, before you go. Like Darcy was mentioning, and what Kavita and Shamini were saying, women have, from birth and from motherhood and from stages of experiences, they have what it takes to take people through the transition. However, like Indra Nui said and is quoted by Shamini, the biological clock and the career clock kind of conflict with each other, and we lose them at their best. What is your assessment of the situation from your experience?
Yeah, so I think, it was really interesting to hear the presentations on sort of innate skills that women bring to the table that are, much more prevalent in women versus men. So I think, for me, organizations that value that. So value skills like collaboration, value skills like high emotional intelligence, I think typically are much better suited to adapt, to actually create a space for women to thrive, if they're intentional about it. Typically, organizations that value cultures like assertiveness, leader knows everything. You know, there are some organizations with cultures like that, and I feel that they typically have a much harder time adapting. And what we found is, I mean, our organization, we make consumer brands for women, right? So I think it's very important that women have a seat at the table. And it is a very collaborative organization. So what we found is we've actually been able to convert, you know, this culture of helping women thrive into a competitive advantage in the marketplace and also in the talent space, where we're able to actually attract star women by virtue of the fact that they want to work in a culture that enables them to thrive, right? So I think that's been really nice to see. Secondly, and I think this is underestimated, like how important networks are to succeed at your job. Sometimes merit alone doesn't get you through. Because I think unless your ideas are heard and unless you're in a position of influence, you know, actually pushing things through become quite difficult. So I think an organization, if you really want women to thrive, it's critical that you solve for both the formal and informal networks that stop women from actually exercising influence on decision making. And I think some ideas on what can be done about it. I think what we found is when we put women on cross-functional teams intentionally, made them leaders of cross-functional teams. We've had great outcomes, and also then they're able to form networks a lot easier. And so I think, you know, really changing the ecosystem of the organization that has existed in the same way for decades, I think it has to be a priority if organizations want women to succeed, because you can't really throw women in a man's world and expect them to succeed, right? So I think, you know, that requires attention. And I have 10 minutes, sorry.
Thank you. Mehrini, I mean, she said the stage for my question to you. It's a man's world. I mean, not fully, but most of the time that's how it is. So changing this, be it culture, be it structure, is not the easiest thing. So if we are to make way for women and to give her an ecosystem where she's supported to lead, how difficult is this transition, and what should organizations do about it from perhaps leadership, from a leadership perspective at all stations?
Okay, so I think I'd like to build on one thing that you said about that if we are not at the table, then things don't change. So I think for one of the things is that if our voices are not heard, things that are good for us and that will help us thrive won't get into the agenda. So if one of the things is she talked about networks, and I'm also thinking about building male allies. We need, if we are not at the table, we need to work with our male allies to make sure that we get there, that we become part of the agenda. But then we can't always wait to be invited. We don't always get invited. So there's this thing I sometimes think about, you know, being nice may not get you anywhere. Being nice just keeps you in your place. So it's about looking at how do we build these dialogues, these, you know, you talked about your, you know, intentionally building cross-functional teams. So if we don't have these kinds of conversations and we don't have these dialogues, and if we don't push our agenda forward, we won't be heard. So once when we have our voice there, because you're looking at 50% of the population, potential employees that you're losing out if we are not there. And then you have people who bleed every month, who have, who get pregnant, who raise children, who go through menopause, coming there and saying, we don't want to hide this, we want to thrive because this is who we are, this is part of our human condition. So I think that's really important, and to be able to talk about these things. You know, that because organizations are traditionally inherently masculine. Or built for males, and we've designed organizations coming from, you know, we talked about strategy and tactic, all that is coming from the military. So we're looking at, you know, thousands of years of military, and that coming into management and organizations or industrialized organizations in the last 200, 300 years. So we need to now change that. In none of our history books do we hear women did while the men went to war, because our stories are not written. So we have to now write these stories and talk about what it is like for us to be seen and to be heard.
Mihir, in your experience as a leadership coach, what have you seen as common traits of companies that have successfully at least attempted and transitioned somewhat in terms of ecosystem?
In terms of bringing women to the table. I think I'm going to build on what, this is about these agentic skills and the relational or communal skill. So we think about agentic skills as traditionally we imagine that they're male skills, they're masculine traits, and the relational skills are feminine skills. But there is enough research to also show that we are nurtured for these skills from the time we are small. And so the point is that if you look at slightly older competency frameworks that we used to prepare, we gave priority to these agentic skills, not the relational skills. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing is like what she also said, is that organizations which are prioritizing not just agentic but also relational skills, and not just imagining that agentic skills won't come from women. Women do have, and in the same way, men also have relational skills, but it's not showcased. They haven't had the opportunity to develop it because they haven't been brought up in that way, and the same way for women. So I think creating those, if you're looking at like organizations that have build those competency frameworks and develop all leaders for them, I think are likely to be more successful.
Thanks, Mihir. Fantastic. Looking at these two types of skills, in your view, do you think that, we need 100% of the workforce, we need both types of skills. Are any of these skills difficult to attain or difficult to duplicate or difficult to maybe neutralize among genders? And looking at it from a complete people perspective, what should organizations do to really harness all these skills?
Yeah, I think if you look at transformation, we need skills like empathy and creating those holding environments, discussions. And typically these are easier to get from females, like the research suggests. But the fact there is we lose them at that time. We lose them at that time, the exact time we need them. And change is also seen more from a very masculine perspective. How do we get this done? So we kind of try to force our way through that. And that's what happens in many organizations. So I feel that, I was listening to Kavita's research. There is a lot we can get from females there. And I don't see organizations really leveraging that aspect. So it's there, but it's a matter of how do you harness that from what we have.
Thank you, Nancy. I want to move on to the third topic that we've covered, organizational transformation and skills. Now to talk about the actual barriers that women leaders face. I think it was Kavita who was talking about the glass place, how women, when they are given the chance, when the rate of failure is probably higher than what it is for men. If I can ask Sabrina first, what is this like, in Sri Lanka, if we take the corporate sector, what is your assessment of this? And what is the gap?
Yeah, so I think women at the top are definitely the exception and not the rule. And if I think about it, I think there are three barriers that have to be solved for until we're going to make this the rule. One is that I think typically DEI programs focus on the woman at work. So you try to make the workplace a more inclusive and friendly place or a place where women feel empowered. But I think, that is missing the fact that the reason why women typically have to take a step back in their career is not because they don't want to give their 100% at work, it's because they have to balance the role, not just at work, but in the home. So I think, that requires conversations around flexible work, that requires conversations around, how the organization has programs that help women reintegrate back into work after becoming a mom. So I think, all of those things require taking childcare and taking sort of elderly care, typically burdens that fall on the woman, the caregiver role, as part and parcel of something that the employee tries to actively solve for. So one is the barrier to that caregiving places on women's ability to succeed. Secondly, I think the status quo barrier, where we typically look at particular functions in the organization and we say, these are not suitable for women. So we automatically discount particular functions by virtue of the fact that it's too difficult for women to work here. I run an organization with a very large sales force, and it has taken me a very long time to convince people that sales actually, and particularly when they're selling products to women. So I think leveraging that skill and figuring out how to do that is the part and parcel of the organization, right? So once we realized that we had to solve for things like transport, we had to solve for things like having a buddy system to sort of up the safety on the field. I think we found that actually, strangely, last month, our female RSM or regional sales manager actually topped the leaderboard in terms of sales growth. So it's telling us that actually if an organization takes that time to challenge these status quo barriers, the organization will also benefit. Thirdly, I think there's a barrier of bias, of course. I think in the hiring and promoting process, it is natural, right? It is something that I think all of us have to some degree, whether we like it or not. And so I think investing more in objective tools to assess candidates on their merit helps us challenge that bias. And so I think when an organization goes that extra mile to invest in objective assessments, in sort of gender-blind ways to navigate merit, I think that typically helps you shed that curtain of bias and look at the individual or the candidates or the skills that she brings to the table. And I think it gives people more confidence then to solve for some of those other things, because it's not a pity party. It's something that you do based on merit and based on where you feel the organization can most benefit.
Thanks, Sabrina. Talking of leveraging, I'm going to be the devil's advocate and say we are seeing organizations and even countries put women on the driving seat at times of chaos and at times of crisis. Is this necessarily bad? Is it good? What is your assessment and how should be the way forward?
I don't know whether to say it is good or bad. From what the research shows that there are often times that women have been put to those roles. Because I also think about it in terms of that women have been doing emotional labor for centuries, which is not counted. Imagine if this emotional labor is counted and is part of our GDP, what that would look like. But nobody says thank you to them, saying, well, thank you for all what you've done. So I think when I look at, maybe I look at it in terms of some of the women leaders I work with, where they found themselves in this particular role. Often, they are set up to fail. And even when they do even if they do succeed, very often it's not appreciated, it is expected. But whereas the way, because I don't think that women also know how to make a big deal out of it. So we don't promote ourselves. So, I know this for myself. Personally, I talk with my friends, like promoting oneself feel a bit shy. Whereas because men have always had the opportunity to promote themselves, they've been given the space, it comes more naturally to them. We have, because women don't always get appreciated for all of what they do, they also discount what they do. So the output is seen, the outcome is seen, the amount of sacrifice or the work that goes into it is not seen. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but I think I'm going back to saying that it's not about, us saying that, oh, it's about also assessing what skills are needed in a particular type of crisis. So if you go back to, these agentic skills and, relational skills, some skills might be needed, which is much more about getting the job done. So again, it's going back to, what I said about earlier, where agentic skills are about goal orientation. Going back to my war metaphor, men weigh more and they were agentic regardless of collateral damage. Now we're saying that's not enough. We're saying that we can't just say, oh, in order to get through this crisis, we can't help the collateral damage. So we need relational skills. So it's a combination. So I think this is a time for us to develop both sets of skills. And I'm saying that we need to, from upbringing to our leadership development, to ensure that both genders, we may have a predominant skill, but that it can become part of our toolbox. We don't have to say, oh, well, I'm very empathetic and therefore I don't know how to make a decision. Or I get the job done and I can't be looking at, who gets affected. I will get the job done. So I think that we need to build in those complexities in those skills is what I'm kind of seeing that I'm working with when I'm working with male or female leaders now.
Thank you, Meghani. Sabrina, my last question to you. Given the complexities and one being women discounting their own contributions, how do organizations, go away from a one-size-fits-all approach to going for more tailored measures, and how difficult? Because I understand it might not be easy as, flipping to the next chapter. What should organizations do and how difficult will it be?
Yeah, I know it doesn't sound revolutionary when I say it, but you would be surprised how many times people forget this in an organization. Employees are human beings, right? And they have, it's not just about women or men or whatever, but I think, human beings are not all the same. They are different ages, they have different interests, they have different obligations and responsibilities. And I think, what we found, and now given the generational gap between what we're seeing in Gen Zs versus what we're seeing in millennials to what we're seeing in baby boomers are so vastly different. That a cookie cutter approach no longer works. And if the point of an organization and the point of rewards and recognition and compensation is to engage employees of human beings, I think it is critical that we customize our toolbox, or the tools which we use to really get the best out of our people. And so that's why, it's important. It's easier said than done, but it's really important that the organization looks at the life cycle of the employee in terms of what she or what he needs at any given moment, right? So for example, we've seen, and I'll step away from talking about women for a moment, because I think here the age matters probably more in terms of what an organization can do differently. So I think with Gen Z employees, what we found is a deep need for purpose and meaning. So here, more than the compensation, it's really important that the organization works really hard to place these employees in a job role that they find really helps them lean into that purpose and meaning. With millennials, as the responsibilities are growing, typically they have younger kids, they're looking at making big investments like a house or a car. They are, I think, giving them more security on where they're at and how their career can grow and how the organization will actually invest in them. Or that growth is critical. And then, with baby boomers, typically you find this resurgence of time. And with this time, some people want to take on more, but also some people also want to give back in terms of mentorship and development. So I think, quite apart from gender, it's about how do you customize your organization's toolbox to suit, the employee or the human being at different phases in their life, and to really complement that. And we found whenever we've done that, it's actually great for business because it reduces your employee cost significantly, because typically in a one size fits all, you're just throwing more money at the problem, right? Like hoping that it solves itself. And typically does that, and you keep throwing more and more money, and that really drives the cost of an organization up. And, you still get really high levels of attrition, which we know is incredibly costly. So what we've, what I think is really important is if you take a life cycle approach to benefits and compensation and rewards and recognition, you typically are able to reduce the cost associated with doing business, and that makes the organization more valuable.
Thank you, Sabrina. And thank you. I will pause for now and say a very big thank you to you for being here with us. Thank you. Yes, really, thank you. Sabrina spoke of customization, and I want to talk of one aspect of it, which is empathy, which was, I think, touched on by all the presentations. Where, even Shanika's presentation, we found how employees perceived leaders not, supporting them because they were in a different place when it comes to work-life balance. And empathy is, I think we've established the fact that it's necessary. What do you think really causes this lack of empathy? I mean, it's so obvious that it should be there.
So I think I want to link it to the inability for us to be vulnerable. So if our role models of leadership are this stoic, nothing affects me, I'm not emotional, so that's our role model. And I think, just building on what Sabrina said, we're human beings. We have things that are going on. We are faced by things. We get upset. We have our own weaknesses, but leaders don't have the space for that vulnerability. So if you're not allowed to be vulnerable, and especially if you've been brought up, especially if you're a boy child and you're a man and you're not allowed to be vulnerable because that's a weakness, which means you're not in touch with yourself. So if you're not in touch with yourself, you can't be in touch with someone else. Because if you do not understand your own human condition and relate to yourself, you're not able to relate to someone else's issues. So I think that was one of the interesting things that, that many of the leaders, by the time they get to the top, they've already passed the stages. So they're, because it's about forgetting, so there it's about forgetting. But if we, so I think about how do we build leadership in such a way that we can be consciously vulnerable, that we showcase what it means to be vulnerable. And it sometimes comes across very awkwardly, so which is why I talk about consciously vulnerable. I don't mean that we have to go and tell all the problems we have, all the issues that we're going through, or reveal all our deepest fears. But if we were able to be a little bit open, and in our mentorship, in our coaching, in our leadership, we were able to show others, well, yeah, I struggle there too. I remember that. And if you connect to that, then people will also see you as a human being, and you start seeing other people as human beings. And I think the second part is that you have to be unafraid to have these sticky conversations. Sometimes you may not understand somebody else because you have a vast different experience to that person. But if you're not willing to sit in the discomfort of asking, how are you feeling? So I was doing this workshop, and a feedback workshop. And one of the things is that everybody asks, gives feedback on, so this is how you've done, but nobody asks, so how is this landing on you? I've just told you, you've got a 2 and not a 5. How is this landing on you? Because you don't want to hear the answer. So if you're not willing to hear the answer, you don't want to enter the conversation. So then you don't know what's going on, and you cannot build empathy. So I think that's one of those 2 of the key things I think that we need to start developing as leaders.
Thanks, Minnie. Conscious vulnerability. That's, I'm going to ask you about something unconscious. I mean, when we are talking about women and men and all the issues in the workplace, unconscious biases come to me because traditional work norms and gender strain, theories, all of these talk of unconscious biases that still remain unconscious. While we take people through the transition, through transformation and change, how can unconscious bias be mitigated to the most part, at least?
Okay, I think 2 serious words. One is unconscious, other one is bias. We start with bias. Bias itself is bad. And biasness makes us take very bad decisions because we want to stereotype everyone into boxes and categorize, so it's very safe for us to look at it. So when the bias is unconscious, I think it's terrible because you don't know that you're doing it, right? And you think you're doing the right thing. So I think Mihrini was speaking about a lot of self-awareness. That's the starting point today. A lot of self-awareness. And some of the research that Shamindri's work came from McKinsey, 2021, the most important leadership quality or the trait is leadership. So my reflection there is, where do you learn leadership? Because we become marketers and we do this course. We want to be an engineer, we do this. We want to be an accountant, we do this. But where do people learn leadership? You pick it along the way with a lot of residue and with a lot of things that you see. And given the world we live in, picking leadership from your boss may not be the most intelligent thing because they come from a different world and what we need is something very different. So then I think at all levels, irrespective of the life stage you are in, companies need to invest on leadership a little bit more than what's happening. Because that's the only place that you can change a lot of things that we've been talking about today. Because leaders need to have those new lenses, and more leaders go through self-awareness, they will understand there is something called bias. And they will understand that there is something unknown to me that's happening with me that I need to be aware of. So as we kind of discussing this program, it's all about making the conscious unconscious conscious. So if we can make the unconscious conscious, we'll have much better leaders coming through. And one way I would say is good leadership training, development, and reflection.
Thank you, Dusty. Mihir, I want to comment on this, but I also want to ask the audience members. We are open to questions now. So if you have any questions, I'm sorry Sabrina is not here. If you have any questions to Mihiri or Dusty, please let Bodakshi know. Bodakshi, can you wave? All right, yes. Just let her know and we'll get the mic across to you. Mihiri, coming back to what Dusty said, the best way to beat unconscious bias is to, learn, develop, and groom leaders to know that there is biases in themselves. What are your thoughts on this?
Have those conversations. So, recently a friend of mine said, oh, she wears the pants in the house, and I like bristled. And then we had this really meaningful conversation, and he said, I didn't mean it, that I didn't mean that she was a man, but we had this huge discussion about the history of using that term. So I think our words matter. But because it's so much part of our language, and of course, the way we say things make our language rich. I'm not saying that we need to strip off everything, but I think having those conversations, having some courage, maybe you can't say this in big crowds, but at least in your close relationships to bring those up so that we also teach each other. So I think, so one is self-awareness. And one of the other ways to be self-aware is to have somebody, slightly prod you and say, oh, that didn't make me feel good. Or this is what I thought you said, and is that what you meant? So I think having those conversations is the other one.
The sticky conversations.
Yes, the sticky conversations.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Any questions or remarks? Okay. Then I think we can move on to concluding our thoughts. Really, I would like to ask you, we're talking about the role of women in organizational transformation. We've spoken about a lot of things from why we need women to be there, because we're moving away from just having a tick box checked in our agenda that we have a woman. We're moving into a much mature place than that. Then we also spoke of the skills that really facilitate successful transition, and we ended up with talking about overcoming barriers for women leaders. Against this backdrop, what will be your concluding thoughts tonight?
Yeah, so I'm going to link it to the one of these 10 things, it had systems thinking, and I said, oh, I'm so glad to see that, So if when we are looking at making these things, it's happening at the individual level, it's happening at the organizational level, it's happening at the social and cultural level. I think when we are making these changes, it's really important to look at all these levels, because things don't happen in a vacuum. So recently, I was having a conversation with a client, and she's a single mom, and she's worked really hard. She's come to the top of her profession. She's now making way for other women leaders to come. She has influence in the organization. She's a transformation specialist. She said, we've cleared the way in the organization to help women thrive, but they're leaving. So the point is, it's not enough for it to happen only at the organization level. So organizations that have some power needs to start having those conversations at wider or create this even environments to create social change. So you may have cleared the path in the organization, but her path may not be clear given her family background, given her cultural background. Because she said one of the girls was 28, she was super talented, really, ready to take on a leadership role. She said, no, but I have to get married, it's part of my faith, and then I get married, I can't work. So she was like, why? I mean, everything's available. But the point is that it's not just at that level, that we have to make the changes at other levels as well. So for example, this, like a John case, the 100 days parental leave. Not everybody wants to take it, but if organizations take that big, bold step, then maybe it won't happen in the next 2 years, but in the next 5 years or 10 years, this change will happen, because then men will also see caregiving as part of their job responsibility. That they don't have to be only agentic, that they can allow themselves to be relational. And share that this is not they're not babysitting, they're just bringing up their children, So I think that's one of the things. And obviously, if we don't have 50% of the population there, we're losing a huge richness. So that's obviously obvious. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity and this really delicious conversation.
It was lovely to have you. That's it. How can we take this beyond the organization?
I think I'll speak a little bit about from what I started today. Every organization we talk to, they're saying transformation. Transformation is in our agenda, we want to do that. And in that, two parts become so important. One is, of course, technology, other one is people. So the people agenda is becoming even more important today. And leaders as change agents. And for them to understand and influence, I think that is becoming extremely important in organizations today. And looking at the topic today, women in transformation, earlier it was more like a quota, more like a nice to do thing. But what we see from the research today, it's becoming an essential ingredient in this whole transformation. So that's the fascinating thing for me. And we want to take this message to organizations so that they can really benefit from this research.
Thank you, Dusty. Thank you, Dusty and Lily. And thank you to our audience. We will now conclude the panel discussion, move on to the last bit of today's this evening. Thank you very much. I would like to give you a small token of appreciation